What does it mean to be well read? How can we choose which books are worth our time and which ones aren't? Is it okay to give up on a book that we're not enjoying? Do audiobooks count as reading? Well, on this episode of the podcast, we're tackling all these questions and a lot more. Our guest is Andy Naselli, a professor at Bethlehem College and Seminary and author of How to Read a Book, Advice for Christian Readers. We'll talk about the importance of reading in the Christian life, how we can overcome some bad reading habits, different layers of reading, how to instill a love of books in our kids, and a lot more. As always, I've taken the notes for you at reasonabletheology.org, where you can find additional information and links to the resources we talk about. So let's kick things off with Andy Naselli as we discuss how to read a book. All right, well, Dr. Naselli, thanks so much for joining me for the podcast.
My pleasure.
Now, to start things off, could you share a little bit about what your teaching ministry looks like?
Yeah, for the last 11 years, I have taught at Bethlehem College and Seminary in Minneapolis, Minnesota. That's a school that John Piper is chancellor of, and I am professor of systematic theology and New Testament, and I also get to teach ethics. I love it.
Wonderful. Yeah, excellent. Yeah, Minneapolis not far from my neck of the woods here in Grand Forks. In the wintertime, we go to Minneapolis to get warm, so...
That's not the right place to go.
You got this new book out called How to Read a Book. So you have a book about reading books. So it's a little bit bookception. Can you tell me about why you decided to write this?
Yeah, my job is to teach people how to read, not like kindergartners' ABCs, but how to teach adults how to read with skill and to read with increasing ability to understand what authors intend to communicate. And I found that talking about reading is so interesting to people. It's like no one ever talks about this part of it. It's just they figure you can sound out words, so just go do it. And I found that students excel when you can train them to get better at reading. And in my classes, I actually assign reading at 3 different levels. So I'll say something like, read this part really carefully. I call it micro reading. Read this a little less carefully, but every word still, call it macro reading, and then spend at least X number of minutes with this dissertation or this book or this article. So I'm training them along the way, and they've loved that. So it's not just a one-speed bike.
Yeah, actually, that sounds great. Having gone through seminary and and maybe it was a false assumption. On my end, I assumed if it was assigned, they wanted me to know it front and back, read every word, read the whole thing. And they're assigning hundreds of pages of reading for every, multiple classes in the same semester. And you feel overwhelmed. And maybe that's not even what they intended.
Right.
So if there are any other seminary professors, please take a note of that and let your students know. If you just want them to kind of acquaint themselves with the book or you need them going deep into the book, that would be extremely helpful. So I'm sure they do appreciate that a lot.
Yeah, and for people who don't enjoy reading with their eyes, or the idea of reading a book on how to read a book sounds like just horrible, I also recorded an audiobook version that's short, maybe 4 or 5 hours, and you can listen to it while you're driving or doing whatever, and that might be a helpful spur to try more audiobooks or maybe get into books again.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Absolutely. So some people might be familiar with another book of the same title, How to Read a Book, Mortimer Adler, older, pretty thick. And, I've got it on my shelf. Have I read it? No, but I own it. And so how does yours differ from that? How does it maybe complement that book? How does it expand upon that book?
Yeah, I don't see mine as replacing his. His is over 400 pages. It covers in more detail areas that mine does not. But mine's different in several important ways. One is mine's written by a Christian, and Mortimer Adler was a pagan. That's how he described himself when he wrote his book. I wrote my book specifically for fellow Christians. So my whole mindset's different than Adler's as he's writing. Another is that my book is broader in scope than Adler's. A big way is that he is focused on writing to get information. And I think that's good, but that there's more to reading than just acquiring information. One of the most enjoyable parts about reading is that it's a delight. It's fun, and that includes reading fiction and other kinds of non-serious books that Adler wouldn't deal with. Also, I write more accessibly, so Adler is very much a kind of stuffy professor as he's writing, which isn't bad. But I'm a little more accessible. I'm more concise for sure. His is so long, and I'm more personal. So I use more anecdotes, and I think more relevant. And his book came out first in 1940, and then a second edition in 72. I mean, that's over 50 years ago. The update,
Yeah.
the iPhone just didn't come out till 2007. I mean,
Yeah.
our whole way of taking in books and audiobooks and just reading whatever has just been revolutionized since the advent of smartphones.
Yeah.
So I try to address that as well.
Yeah, it kind of makes me think of, Neil Postman's Amusing Ourselves to Death. It's a
Right.
classic book about all the distractions of life, but that was written when like he's like, "Oh, there's a lot of radio out there. The radio can really distract you." I mean, so
Mm-hmm.
far before what
Mm-hmm.
exponentially is, social media everywhere, digital, always on technology, that sort of thing. So, kind of in that same
Mm-hmm.
line, super helpful, maybe a bit dated from a context perspective that you can move kind of that conversation forward in our own
That's right.
context.
Yep.
So in your own classes, you mentioned that you teach people how to read, and you're talking, they're this is post like a bachelor's degree, right? So these are adults. They're into their master's level programs, and you really see your job in many respects as teaching them how to read a book.
Well, I teach them how to exegete the Bible primarily, and that means you're reading other works that help you do that. So whether you're reading the Bible or a book about the Bible or whatever, if you don't have the skill set to accurately assess what did this author intend to communicate, you're going to make a mess of things. You're not going to do as well. So I try to train students to do that well.
And no doubt probably untrain some bad habits. What are some bad habits that people can get into just when it comes to reading?
Oh, there's so many. I just started working on a new book uh, called Exegetical Fallacies. So D.A. Carson is my mentor, and he wrote this and it came out in 1984, second edition in 96, and I just agreed to do a co-authored third edition. So I'm revising
Wow.
the whole thing. I just started on it this week, and there are just dozens and dozens and dozens of fallacies. A fallacy is just a misguided belief based on unsound reasoning, and exegesis is basically careful reading. So biblical exegesis is carefully reading the Bible. So an exegetical fallacy is when you're wrongly reading a text, especially the Bible. And you can do this with grammar, logic, history, theology. There's just so many ways to bring
Yeah.
in unsound opinions, speculations, assumptions, and then kind of baptize them into, well, spiritual things are spiritually discerned, or the Holy Spirit told me, or I'm just sure I'm right. Uh, and we want better than that. We want to be able to support our interpretations with sound arguments to show sound reasons that our beliefs are reasonable and right.
Yeah. And I think that the general opinion of our culture today is people don't read. Is that fair? Would you agree with that? I mean, obviously oversimplification, it's generalization, but would you agree that in our day and age, people really aren't readers?
Well, they're reading different mediums. So they read a lot of text messages and a lot of social media posts. They're not reading as many books. And if they are, they're not reading them for a sustained periods of time.
Yeah.
I just read a book by Jonathan Haidt called The Anxious Generation, and it's frightening what's happened to youth since the advent of the smartphone. Like,
Yeah.
wow.
No, absolutely. So that's a good point though, is they might be reading lots of words in a day. I mean, you just think of how we're bombarded with advertising, or you said text messages, or people scrolling Facebook or reading the news. I mean, we're reading, but maybe not intentionally reading. And I don't you're not making a point of like a ebook or print book. necessarily, but they're not intentionally taking up a text in order to read, understand, and appreciate it.
Yeah, I'm in my mid 40s now, so I'm not that old. But when I was writing my dissertation, I lived in a small apartment that had no internet access, and I would work all day long in that apartment, and I'd read books, print books, cover to cover, and articles, and I would just be focused for 10 hours straight. And then at the end of the day, break, have dinner with my wife, and then I might go to a library and check email or something like that. But today, if I'm doing serious reading, if I get to the end of a section or a chapter,
Yeah.
I'm tempted to take a short break and check my email and refresh Twitter. And it. I am ashamed to say that I've become intellectually more flabby than I used to be because of
Yeah.
the changing technologies and distractions that I haven't fought off as successfully.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. I recognize that in myself as much as I understand that it's an issue just out there in general and that people ought not do that. And I do the exact same thing. I have to think and fail probably most days to not pick up my phone first thing when you wake up in the morning, or when you're coming to a hard part of the book, take a mental break and just scroll some cotton candy type social media stuff. It's really easy to get into that, and that's probably one of the habits that was maybe unique to us, is that we've got these little dopamine machines and these glowing rectangles that we can constantly turn to when our brains get a little bit bored or we're encountering something maybe a little bit more difficult.
And worse is notifications. So I
Yeah.
turn off all notifications on my computer and other devices. If I want to have a serious reading session or a serious time to think or write a sermon or whatever, something that's serious, I need sustained time. I need to treat that like an appointment.
Yeah.
Like right now, you and I are talking, and I have not checked my email or my tweets or my text messages in this conversation thus far. And that's normal. Why can't we do that in other areas? We have
Yeah.
self control because we're looking at each other, even though it's not in person. Uh, I'm saying we need that kind of self controlled self discipline
Yeah.
when we're trying to do serious reading.
Yeah, and it is a discipline. I mean, reading is not a natural thing. We have to learn it, we have to get better at it, and we have to really give it attention. And maybe we can say now more than ever, it takes a lot of discipline. It probably always has. Now
Mhm.
there's lots of people that you can talk to, and they'll say, "Oh, I wish I had more time to read," or "Oh, I wish I could read this book," or whatever. There's probably also some people that really don't care that much. Could you make the case for what is lost when we don't read, when we're not reading books? What are we losing out on?
Yeah, well, someone like that, I'm not insisting that every Christian out there needs to read like I read. I'm a research professor. It's my job. It's my hobby. I just, I don't expect that for, a mom with three young kids or for a guy who's a construction worker and he's working 12-hour days. I'm not expecting everyone to be like me here. But I do think everyone, at minimum, who's a Christian needs to be reading the Bible. That's our daily food. We need that. That's the most important reading of all. And anything beyond that is just helpful and enjoyable. So, someone who doesn't read, I think, is missing out on all sorts of joys and benefits that he may be unaware of. It's kind of like C.S. Lewis talked about a little child who lives in a city, a slum, and loves playing in mud puddles and has no idea what a vacation to a seaside would be like. They're like, "Well, I'm happy right here. Why would I want to
Right.
go to what?" They just don't even know what they're missing.
Yeah.
And once you understand how many options there are for good reading experiences, it's a whole new world where you're far off places, other times, fictional and non-fictional, learning from the best thinkers in the history of the world who've written things down and being able to join a conversation with others, becoming a literary person makes you so much more interesting as you talk to others.
Yeah.
My wife and I actually see people sometimes through the eyes of characters in Dickens novels or whatever. Well, I'll say that reminds me of this guy. Uh, that's just
Well, it expands your world. I mean,
yeah,
you get to kind of live vicariously through Dickens or Lord of the Rings character or whoever else.
right,
It expands and enriches your world in ways that I think we can safely say that movies don't. That these other
oh for sure.
mediums that we have don't.
Yeah. So an example, there's no fictional literature that has influenced me more than the 7 books of the Chronicles of Narnia. I read them repeatedly as a child, and I haven't stopped. I don't know how to calculate how many times I've read it. It's probably 40s or 50s or 60s. I don't know. And my kids are the same, and they've been so. If one of my I have 4 daughters, if one of them is being a little bit sulky, I can just say something like, "Hey, you don't want to be a wet blanket like Eustace, do you?" And that like snaps them out of it. Like, oh no, I don't want to be like Eustace. And if you don't know who Eustace is, and see, we don't have the connection. But if you've
Right.
read the story of Eustace and the Voyage of the Dawn Treader, and you know his story, that comment, being like Eustace, is repulsive. And if you can see that in yourself, that it jolts you. Um, in my book, I actually list out 20 such lessons I've learned from the Chronicles of Narnia in that regard. That's just one of them. Yeah,
Yeah. Well, and of course, Eustace famously is a boy who read all the wrong books.
that's right.
And
That's how I start the chapter.
yeah. And meanwhile, we wanna be well read. What does it mean to be well read and read the right books?
Well, it starts with the Bible, and then no, I don't want to be legalistic here and suggest that to be a good person you have to read all these things. But I think to be a well-rounded person and a literary person, a person with a big view of God and His world, means that you enter the conversation of great Western literature, uh, and some that includes great fiction. So that's why my kids, as they get into junior high and high school, they are in great books programs. That's why my college, Bethlehem College, is a great books program
Wonderful.
where you're reading, Plato, Aristotle, Shakespeare. You're not just reading, what do they do in schools today? Like it's like Taylor Swift studies or whatever. Like that's like lasts for 3 minutes and gone. So we want to join the conversation that's gone on for millennia. So that's what's going to endure, and focus on the best stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Because there's thousands upon thousands of wonderful books out there. Obviously, we can't read them all, but there's titles that have withstood the test of time and that have benefited humanity for generations, and we ought
Mhm.
not deprive ourselves of those.
Yeah.
As we're thinking through how do I go about picking those books, you mentioned the great books. Can you elaborate on that a little bit? How can a Christian decide what's worthwhile to read? We can't read them all.
Yeah, I would approach this similar to how you choose the right foods to eat. So it's some of it is just staple what you need to survive, and some of it's what's available. What are you interested in? What do you most enjoy? So, uh, for my children, my wife and I have tried to cultivate a desire to read the Bible mainly, and then also to read really good stories. We love good stories, and there's so many good stories out there to read. Stories that help you understand human characters better, understand God's world better, past, present, um, and then also read books that are helping you better understand God's world. So it could be understanding geography and history and animals, and God's world is amazing. So books that help you enlarge your vision of God's world and God Himself ultimately are ones that are most helpful.
Hey, everybody, I hope you're enjoying this conversation. Just want to interrupt quickly and let you know about a helpful resource I've put together. If you're looking for a list of good books to read, you need to check out the 5-Foot Bookshelf. You see, there was a Harvard professor in the early 1900s who said that all you needed for a thorough education could fit on a 5-foot shelf, and that set of books became known as the Harvard Classics. Well, inspired by that, I've created a list of all the books a Christian would need to have a solid personal library, all on a single 5-foot bookshelf. The list includes biblical studies, literature, history, biography, and a lot more. So check it out at reasonabletheology.org/bookshelf. Now let's get back into the conversation. Now, you already mentioned it kind of at the outset of the conversation. One of the things you go over in the book is these layers of reading. Could you go into that in a little bit more detail?
Yeah. So most people, when they think about reading a book, they think that means you read every word carefully, slowly, such that you could be quizzed on it and you would know what's in the book. So you really master the content. And that is a good way to read the best books. We want to read some books that way. but we can't read every book that way, um, especially if you want to read widely. So I'm a research professor, which means I'm supposed to be reading a lot and widely, which means sometimes I'll give a book all of 30 seconds. So that if I go through it super fast, I'd call that surveying, where I size up who's the author, what's the book about, what's its argument, what's do an X-ray, what's its skeletal structure, um, who's recommending this book. Are they people that are trustworthy? Uh, um, you can size up a book really quickly, and I do that for lots of books daily. And then in between, so you could survey in 30 seconds, you can survey for 10 minutes or an hour. In between, there's what I call macro reading, which is like listening to an audiobook. You're reading every word, but you're not stopping along the way. You're moving. You got a clip. The micro reading could be a combination of the first of micro reading and macro reading. It's kind of like if you're driving down the highway, you're going 60 miles an hour, and then the traffic gets a little thicker, and you're down to 40, maybe down to 20, might be rolling down to 3 or 2, then back up to 60. Reading can be like that as well. But just having those categories in your head can be freeing, because you might be reading a book and think, this book is really boring right here, really badly written, but I paid $10 for this book. I got to read every word, and I have to finish this book before I move on to the next one. And I've just given this gift to so many people: is free your wrongly informed conscience. You do not have to finish every book you read, and you do not have to read every word of every book you read. It's just not necessary. Life's too short to waste it on bad books.
Yeah, I had to learn that lesson years ago. Is I finally let myself not finish a book, and yeah, it is freeing. It's like this weight that you've been carrying for no reason. It's like, oh, I can just stop and nothing bad happened.
That's good.
Yeah. So when you're surveying, are you doing that to decide whether it's worthwhile to macro or micro read? Why are you surveying?
Many reasons. One of them is kind of like what you might do when you're on Amazon and you look at the look inside feature. You're thinking, what is this book about? Do I want to invest resources, time, and money into this book or not? So it could be you're just trying to size it up. Another reason is you are trying to figure out if this is a tool that you'll want to use later. So maybe you're writing a book or an article or preparing a sermon series or whatever, and you're trying to figure out, is this a book I want to come back to? So you look it over and think, oh, this is definitely what I want to come back to. And then you put that tool in your tool shed or in your somewhere where you can access it. Um, Another reason is you might try to figure out, is this a book that I should be concerned about that could wrongly or badly influence people I'm trying to shepherd? Is this something I need to be aware of? Or is this something that I would enjoy reading on vacation? Or is this something I'd enjoy reading for? There are all kinds of reasons to survey. You're basically doing intel. It's just kind of scoping out, what is this thing about, so that you can then make the next steps of the decisions of how you might use it in the future.
Yeah, really helpful. And we've mentioned audiobooks already. I love audiobooks. I listen to audiobooks all the time, mowing the lawn, driving somewhere. How do you recommend people make use of audiobooks?
Yeah, there's a section in my book. I think I give 11 reasons why audiobooks are beneficial. They're awesome. I mean, can you imagine what it would cost to hire a professional reader like Andy Serkis to read The Lord of the Rings to you at any volume and speed and time of day? Like this, what would that cost an hour? And yet, for a pittance, you can get a book that he's completely read. He's not just read it; he's performed it, and you can take it everywhere you go. Like this is just amazing. So audiobooks are great to use when I'll just go through the day. I wake up and I hit play on the Bible. The first thing I do is I take in the Bible as an audiobook. That's the first part of my day. Then usually I'm working out, and then I'm listening to audiobooks after the Bible while I'm working out. Then if I'm eating lunch alone, I've got earbuds in and I'm listening to audiobooks then. Uh, in the evenings before I fall asleep, when the lights are out, noisemakers on, I can put an earbud in and for the last 20 or 40 minutes, listen to an audiobook and then go to sleep, and without having to have a light on. So your body's adjusting to the dark. Right? And I can listen to it when I'm driving to work, driving back. If I'm doing anything alone that's with my hands, like washing dishes or yard work, whatever, it's just the ability to have an audiobook is just amazing. Can you imagine what John Calvin or Jonathan Edwards would have done with that. I mean,
Yeah,
they're famous, or I think it was Edwards would write notes while he's on horseback and would pin them to himself, and he'd
right.
come home and have like notes all over himself pinned. Imagine him with our technology.
Yeah. No, I can't. I mean, the output that these guys, the Puritans and whoever else had without the things we had really puts us to shame in more ways than
And their
one. So,
libraries were so small; they were under 400
yeah,
books. Calvin's and
right.
Edwards.
They had, access to a few maybe depending on what era we're talking about. So where do you come down on the debate about whether audiobooks count? Do they count as having read the book?
Yes, they do, but then we're going to debate what counts as reading a book. I don't keep track of how many books I read. It would be a very high number per year, um, because I survey a lot of books too. And we're not in a competition. This isn't a game. So I don't have an inflated number to give you. My mentor, Don Carson, used to say I read about 500 books a year, and that blow people's minds. How's that even possible? Well, he's including surveying in there. So my wife reads books aloud to our kids. She reads the Bible in the morning. After lunch, she does a read aloud. In the evening, I read to them. And in the evening, they listen to audiobooks. They're constantly being read to. Yes, that counts as reading. I look at the people in the Bible who were or were not literate, and they would have the Bible read to them. That counts as reading. So, is it the most careful reading possible? No. But is it valuable? Yes. And there's something to how we've lost our um, the oral nature of our culture, where we are now so visual. The oral cultures had memories that were astounding, and there's something we've lost by not taking in books audibly as well. So I think there's much to gain from listening to books.
Yeah, I agree completely. And at least for myself, I've found that they're most useful for history, biography, fiction. I don't use them as much for like a theological work where I feel like I'm going to want to back up, reread that, highlight something, underline something. So I personally don't use them that way, but aside from that, I'm using audiobooks all the time.
Yeah, I agree. If I'm going to read a history book or a biography, or a fiction book, I want to give my eyes a break because I'm using them constantly to read
Yeah,
more heavy sledding. However, I have listened to books like Wayne Grudem's Systematic Theology and John Frame's Systematic Theology as audiobooks. And because those are written so accessibly, you can do it.
sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's helpful too. I have
I
to check
can't do
those
a
out.
Jonathan
So
Edwards book on Audible. Like that just,
no, no,
no,
I've tried some Puritans like, "Oh, I'll never get a chance to read all these." And I just you
no,
can't do it. It's
no.
it's it's really difficult to do depending on who you pick up if you're in, some John Owen book or something.
Right, right.
So you mentioned what you do at home, not dissimilar from what our house looks like. Reading the Bible during the day, read alouds in the afternoon as part of homeschool and whatnot, and then I'm typically in the evenings reading through some book. I mean, we just finished Charlotte's Web. We've done The
Mhm,
Hobbits.
mhm.
Different things like that. We've got different ages in the house. So how is that the primary way that we can develop a love for reading in our kids?
Oh yeah, I've got an appendix in the book that lists 22 ways to develop a love for reading in children. But it really just starts with mom and dad loving reading themselves, and
Yeah,
then just building it into the rhythm of the household. Uh, since my kids were the earliest stages, there are books everywhere, board books. We're reading to them, going to the library, come back with you know 50, 100 books a week sometimes. It's like Christmas every week, coming back from the library. The read alouds are great. We're talking about books. We're buying books. We're
yeah.
accumulating personal libraries. It's just to be a Naselli means you're a reader. So and our girls are all in.
Yeah, no, that's great, and I rejoice to see, my son, he usually has a book with him. If we're going somewhere in the car, he thinks he's gonna have some downtime, it's either a book or a notebook because he's writing a book. So, it's great to see kids pick up on that stuff, and they do. They pick up on what their parents, demonstrate as important and worthwhile, and they wanna do the same.
And this goes without saying. I'll say it. If your kids have smartphones, this is probably not going to happen. So thus far, my oldest is a junior in high school, still no smartphone. You can do this. They don't need them.
Yeah, you will get no argument here. I'm going to delay that for as long as humanly possible. And guess what? It's possible a lot longer than people think.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. So in the appendix, and you got several appendices, I guess they are
Yeah.
in there. A lot of lists, which I find helpful. One of which is 40 of your favorite books. I'm not
Mhm.
going to ask you to give all 40. Can
Mhm.
you pick two or three that you just highly recommend? You really need to read this book.
John Bunyan's The Pilgrim's Progress, I'd put right up there. Obviously, the Bible's first, but after that, I'd go to Pilgrim's Progress. It used to be the second to the Bible, the best-selling book in English literature. You had a copy of the Bible and Pilgrim's Progress. Spurgeon read that 100 times. I'm probably in the 50s or 60s of it now. I want to keep reading it till I die. It's so good. It's the single best book on the Christian life, on progressive sanctification. It's amazing. So if you haven't read that, read it. And there are a lot of good audio books of that and various versions of that. Another one, I mentioned it earlier, The Chronicles of Narnia, the 7 books. They're not just kids' books. They are timeless for all ages. And if you have kids, it's a great delight to read them together and to listen to them together. So I highly recommend them. So there's 8.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, you get the whole set in one.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's some tremendous options out there. And again, these are things that depending on, how many generations, but generations of Christians have benefited from these. Obviously, Pilgrim's Progress a lot longer than Narnia, but
Mhm.
nevertheless, these are things that we can enjoy ourselves and pass on to our kids and
Mhm.
really get a lot out of. So well, this has been a great conversation. I really appreciate your love for books and how you try to instill that in the reader. Where can folks go to learn a little bit about you and your work, as also pick up a copy of How to Read a Book?
Yeah. So my name is Andy Naselli, and I have a website, andynaselli.com. So all the links are there. My book's on Amazon. It's from Canon Press. And soon it'll be on Audible. Right now you can stream it on Canon Plus, which is a streaming platform that Canon Press has. And you can get a free version of that for a bit.
Excellent. Well, we'll be sure to link to all those in the show notes for this episode. I'll link to where you can get a copy of the book, some of the books that we mentioned as recommendations as well. You can find that in the show notes at reasonabletheology.org. Our guest has been Andy Naselli, and we've been talking about his book, How to Read a Book. Thanks so much for joining me on the podcast.
Thank you, Clay.
Hey, thanks for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please consider subscribing to the channel and, more importantly, sharing this video with a friend who you think would get something out of it. You can find additional resources at reasonabletheology.org.